Today, I'd like to tell you a story about love and loss, faithfulness and redemption. And no, it's not Hallmark. It comes straight out of the pages of the Bible. The first book of the Bible's New Testament is the Gospel of Matthew. And it begins with the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth, starting with his ancestor Abraham, approximately 1800 BCE. This genealogy list traces Jesus' male ancestors, but there are 5 women named along with their husbands in that genealogy. These 5 women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and of course, Mother Mary. All amazing women. But the story of Ruth stands out because there is a whole book devoted to her in the Old Testament. And I would like to tell you her story. So around 1100 BCE, the land of Judah was composed of the area we now call Israel and the West Bank. Their neighbor to the east was Moab, which is now known as Jordan. These two countries did not get along, and intermarriage between the tribes was frowned upon. Ruth was a Moabite, which makes her a surprise in the family tree of Jesus, because Moabites were a pagan nation who worshiped the god Chemosh, for Chemosh was a god of war. And even though their languages were closely related, they were often at conflict with one another. The book of Ruth begins like this. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem of Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. When the Bible talks about the time of judges, this was when the tribes were ruled by judges rather than kings. And the judges were appointed by God and also by tribal consensus. So it would not be for another 400 years that the kings would rule Israel, first with King Saul, followed by King David. This is the same David that defeated the giant Goliath. So this man from Bethlehem of Judah and his family traveled to Moab because there was a famine in their land. It was a journey of about 50 miles over steep and rugged terrain and would have taken them around 10 days. After they arrived in Moab, the father died, and his widow Naomi is left with their 2 sons. The sons married 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and lived in Moab for another 10 years. And somehow at this point in the narrative, both brothers died, leaving all 3 women widows. Now we have to remember that women at that time relied solely on their husbands and sons for social and economic standing, and they faced a bleak future without them. And needless to say, Naomi was bereft. And the only thing left for her to do was to return to Israel, the land from which she came, to try to seek some form of charity and family connection. She told her daughters-in-law to go back to their families of origin so that they could hopefully marry again and even more hopefully bear sons. After some prodding, Orpah left, but Ruth rejected, got a frog today. Ruth rejected Naomi's instruction and insisted on accompanying her back to Israel. There is a beautiful passage where Ruth responds to her mother-in-law Naomi's request for her to stay in Moab. She said, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you dwell, I will dwell. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord God do so to me, and more also, if even death can separate me from you." A beautiful and moving passage. But maybe the most important part are those 5 words where she says, "And your God, my God." You see the great love and loyalty that Ruth has for her mother-in-law, Naomi. There was also a growing faith in Naomi's God, the one true God of the Israelites. Ruth was placing her devotion and faith not only in Naomi, but in Naomi's God as they faced difficult circumstances together. Ruth was willing to leave everything familiar behind, with no hope of ever returning and no hope of remarrying or having sons, because she would be an outsider in Israel. She was willing to travel with her mother-in-law over the steep and treacherous terrain to be a stranger in a foreign land. But we know from her story that her growing faith in God sustained her. When Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem of Judah, it was the beginning of the barley harvest, and the only way for them to eat was by gleaning, harvesting the leftovers in someone else's field. Now, it's interesting to note here that approximately 200 years earlier, Moses had set down 613 laws for the Israelites that God had given him. Well, one of those laws was the imperative that if you had a field, you were to leave the edges and the corners unharvested so that the widows, the strangers, the orphans could harvest those. I keep thinking about 613 laws, but I guess I shouldn't be. Anyway, yes, that is funny. Ruth had a kinsman of her deceased husband by the name of Boaz. Boaz was an older man, wealthy, with fields of barley and wheat. So Naomi sent Ruth to Boaz's field to glean. Boaz took notice of Ruth and welcomed her to his field. He told her that he had heard how she had left Moab and everything she knew behind to come with Naomi, and he respected her devotion to her mother-in-law. And he even invited her to harvest directly from his field, not just the edges, and he instructed his servants to help her. Barley was a staple grain at that time, and Ruth returned home, her arms full of the harvest. This bounty must have been a great relief, and she told Naomi of meeting Boaz. And you can almost hear the wheels spinning in Naomi's mind. Boaz is a wealthy landowner. He's a relative of some sort, and as such, may have the right and maybe even the responsibility to protect both Naomi and Ruth. So Naomi hatches up a little scheme, one that will hopefully secure a marriage proposal and economic security beyond what Ruth can glean from the fields. And this is where it gets really interesting. Naomi told Ruth to make herself pretty, put on perfume. And that night, after Boaz had eaten and drunk and was in a contented mood, those are the words, contented mood, and fallen asleep, Ruth was to join him on the threshing floor. She was to lie down at his feet and wait for him to wake up to notice her. At face value, these instructions could be innocent. Maybe. But a lot of the words that Naomi used have less innocent connotations. It is also interesting to note that the threshing floor was known to be a place where improper things happened. I think we get the gist here. When Boaz awoke, there was the woman from the barley harvest at his feet. Ruth then boldly asked him to spread his cloak over her. In essence, she was asking him to claim her, to marry her, to protect her. It was an unconventional proposal, to be sure, if not outright entrapment. If Boaz is honorable, which we, the reader, know he was, he will marry this young woman he woke up next to on the threshing floor. Ironically, Boaz seemed to find it charming. Okay. Because this is what he said to her. And now, my daughter, fear not, for I will do for you all that you ask of me. For all the family of our people know that you are a virtuous woman. Boaz was proclaiming that Ruth was honorable and virtuous, and since he had agreed to marry her, no one would argue the point. There was one little glitch, though. Kind of, again, like a little Hallmark movie, you know, there's this little glitch close to the end where you wonder if they're going to get together. There was another kinsman who had an even closer relationship to Naomi's deceased husband, who would be first in line to marry Ruth and inherit Naomi's husband's property. But Boaz was intent on Ruth. And he took his case to the elders of the city and pointed out that by law, if the other kinsman married Ruth, he would have to take on Naomi's name, the family name. And also, Ruth was a Moabite. So it's kind of, pushing that. And the elders decided that, yes, Boaz could go ahead and marry Ruth because the kinsman stepped aside. It cemented Boaz's claim to marriage. So Boaz and Ruth were married and they had a son, Obed. And the women of the village celebrated Naomi's joy in finding a protector to save her and her family. Their son Obed would be the father of Jesse. Their grandson Jesse would be the father of King David. And they all lived happily ever after. The book of Ruth is a story about faithfulness and the faithfulness of God and to God and how that works out in our lives. The simple message is that if we are true and faithful to God, we will be blessed. I hate simple messages. After all, Ruth was a stranger, a Gentile, a Moabite woman, and through her faithfulness and love was rescued in the end and became the great-grandmother of King David and an integral part of the lineage of Jesus of Nazareth. There's a reason I hate simple answers. I just know there's more there. Really, though, just why is her story so important that it rates a complete book in the Old Testament? That is a really good question. I'm glad you asked. I can't answer it. I am not sure, even after spending weeks with this story. But let me tell you what I do now. Once Ruth was in this new country, she ventured into the barley fields, even though being a Moabite woman alone in a group of Israelite harvesters put her in a very vulnerable situation. She showed no hesitation in following Naomi's instructions to pull off the risky scheme to get Boaz to marry her, thereby securing an economic and social future for herself and her beloved Naomi. In fact, though, not only does she follow Naomi's instructions regarding Boaz, but she boldly took it a step further. Naomi, remember, had told Ruth that when Boaz woke up, he would tell Ruth what to do. Instead, when he awoke, Boaz was led by Naomi right down the proverbial garden path. This is a story of extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary boldness by a woman who had no value or standing in the community or the nation in which she lived. Ruth was brave and ready to give up the safety of her country of birth and her family of origin to set out for the unknown with her widowed mother-in-law. We see her strength. And maybe she knew that she was the kind of person who would persevere until she found a way to succeed. Or maybe she thought that she and Naomi working together would find a way to survive. Or more importantly, her faith sustained her because she knew that God would go with them, that God would provide, Naomi's God, the one true God of the Israelites. Ruth was a brave woman, bravery rooted in hope and love for her mother-in-law, and hope that God had something better in store for them. This is a story of discovery and transformation. It's the classic hero's journey. You know, the wonderful stories that they tell of the hero's journey, where it's a difficult and treacherous road to reach one's destiny. And within that journey, there is a barrenness that we all feel when we're in the middle of a storm. For surely Ruth and Naomi were in the middle of a storm. In Bethlehem of Judah, Ruth was a minority and a stranger, but she did not hesitate to go forward. Naomi and Ruth's lives were turned upside down by death and famine, living in foreign countries, being widowed. They both traveled through that barrenness. Ruth was a foreigner and a part of a despised people who had treated Israel with hostility. Nevertheless, through her unswerving loyalty to Naomi, she was welcomed into the community, and by her faith, she became one of the great matriarchs of ancient Israel and a forebearer of Jesus of Nazareth. In a time when women were property and had no value except through their husbands and sons, Ruth, a Moabite, a Gentile in the land of Israel, found hope and love and fulfillment. In a time when women had no intrinsic worth or value, Ruth stands out as brave and faithful to her beloved mother-in-law, Naomi, and to the one God of the Israelites, the God that she chose to honor and to follow. I just love a happy ending, don't you?
Well, that was fun. Thank you, Rosie, very, very much.